Hi guys, this is lesson 2D on the subject of counterarguments, and I'm going to be introducing to you all the subtleties of that today, and hopefully that makes a lot of sense because this is one of those things where it can make or break you as a rhetorician. Understanding all of the different subtleties of how you need to be anticipating your opponent and also responding to them and making sure that they aren't the ones who come out stronger in the end. All of that is what will make or break you in the subject of rhetoric. So that's what we're getting into today with lesson 2D, and I'm going to dive in and hopefully make some sense of all of this. So keep in mind, first and foremost, that counterarguments should help you, never hurt you. There is this logic, one that really almost scientifically has been disproven, that there are a lot of people who try not to use counterarguments because they're afraid that if they bring up counterarguments to other positions, that they're actually giving a point to the other side. That by acknowledging the fact that there is an argument to the other side, that they're going to go ahead and hurt and weaken their own argument, which isn't normally the case. Now, that being said, can you, accidentally use a counter argument that undercuts yourself? Of course you can. Hopefully you don't, but yes, that is something that can absolutely happen. So you want to make sure that you're using them, but using them wisely at the same time, okay? So first off, what exactly are we talking about in this case? Well, a counter-argument is an opposing argument to the one a writer is putting forward. So whenever you're proving something, you have to understand that, okay, well, there's another side to this argument, and that other side of the argument has different reasons for believing their particular perspective. Well, when you're writing a counter-argument, you're anticipating that. You're saying, I know that the opposition is going to be saying X, so that's why I'm going to be saying Y in rebuttal to that. And so that's how counter-arguments function. Okay, it's a way of saying, anticipating what they're saying and weakening their argument in advance before they ever even have a chance to make their argument. And so you can see how that's a very strong position for you to be in, but it's also one that you need to use really intelligently and wisely, okay? They don't, as I mentioned, they don't usually strengthen your opposition. It makes you invulnerable to your attacks. That's how you want to look at it, okay? So when you acknowledge the fact that there is an argument from an opposing individual, chances are it's not going to make you vulnerable. It's going to make you invulnerable because now they don't have anything they can say. And that if you were doing an actual live debate of sorts, that's a great position to be in, where one side will say something like, well, I know the opposition is going to say blank, so I'm going to say yada, yada, yada. Well, what happens when it cuts to the next person who's in that argument? They now no longer can say their very important, cool point that they were going to make because you already said it for them. So it sounds like they've got one less argument than you would expect them to have under that circumstances, all because you just acknowledged that there was an opposition. And so don't look at it as an opportunity for your opposition to be strengthened. Look at it as an opportunity for you to become invulnerable to that one particular argument that they might make, okay? So rather than ignoring a counter-argument, a strong writer will usually address it through the process of concession, refutation, and rebuttal. Those are our three options when it comes to counter-argument. And they're all subtly different and should be used under different circumstances for different reasons, and that's what we're going to get into as we talk about those three. Okay, so first off, we have concession. That's an acknowledgement that an opposing argument may be true or reasonable. And that's okay, okay? Really, only in politics is it a bad thing to say that your opponent has any good ideas whatsoever. In fact, think about all of the value to your ethos that is generated by you making a concession. If you're willing to concede a point, an argument, an idea, then that's really letting the audience see that you are taking the facts into consideration. You're not afraid to admit where the opposition might be true, and therefore your credibility is only enhanced and intensified as a consequence of the fact that you said the opposition had something valuable to say. So that's an important component of this there, all right? Next would be, of course, refutation. Okay, that's a denial of the validity of an opposing argument. So that's saying that you know that this is what the opposition would say. Well, this is why it's wrong. Okay, it's saying that argument doesn't bear weight. That argument is problematic because of one reason or another, or the facts don't hold up for that particular argument, something along those lines. Okay, so that's what we're talking about there. Now, something to keep in mind, as it says here, is a concession is usually accompanied by a refutation. So that's one of those things that can really strengthen your concession if it then segues into that refutation. So you say, I believe that the opponent is right on this one matter. However, I want to point out that their argument that such and such is true isn't necessarily correct. Okay? So you want to, in many cases, sort of unite together that concept of a concession and a refutation so that you can not only build your own ethos by conceding where it's appropriate, but also show how that opposition isn't really understanding the matter as adequately or effectively as you might be. Okay? And then, of course, the third and final one then would be a rebuttal. Okay? This is a technique that presents a contrasting perspective on an argument or its evidence, proposing that some or all of a competing position is unfounded. So, to some degree, a refutation is and a rebuttal are very similar or the same thing. Rebuttal is really sort of assuming that your opposition has made a compelling argument or presented some compelling evidence already, and now it's just your chance to say, okay, well, I mean that's not true, but that's not a good perspective on it, or that doesn't meet our standards of the advantageous as far as Aristotle would be concerned. So that's what we mean by rebuttal. So those are your three options in those situations whenever you're trying to present counter arguments. Okay, so some other things to keep in mind about this whole issue of counter arguments, like I said, they strengthen your argument by demonstrating that you understand a viewpoint other than your own. And think about how cool that is, okay? If you show that you understand all of the viewpoints that are in existence and that you nevertheless came to your own conclusion that such and such is true, then that really strengthens your ethos. Because as it says in the second half of that bullet there, you've thought through other evidence and you stand by your view. You know what the opposition has to say, and yet still you say your contrary opinion on that matter. That's a good position to find yourself in, okay? Some of the things that we do when we're doing counter arguments, first one, and this is, us getting into some of those old Latin terminology that is really integral to rhetoric and the study of rhetoric and the demonstration of rhetoric. We start off here with prolepsis, okay? A figure of thought that anticipates an opponent's or audience's objections. So if you think about that, you might write in an essay, my opponents will tell you that blah, 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 blah. However, yada, 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 okay? That's what we were talking about when we're talking about prolepsis in those cases, okay? We also would have something called hyperphora, okay, which happens all the time, and we don't even realize that we're doing some sort of complex rhetorical technique when we do it. This is a figure that asks a rhetorical question and then immediately answers it. So that whole concept of a rhetorical question kind of is the hypophora. It allows you to anticipate the audience's skepticism and nip it in the bud. So if you say to something in your audience or in your essay, you say, I bet you're asking yourself right now, well, why is blah, 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 blah? Well, I can tell you that, so you know the kind of objections and concerns and issues and problems that your audience is going to have, and you're phrasing them and putting them in language in the same way that they're being put into language in their own minds, but then you're going to go ahead and undercut that with all of your argumentation, okay? You do want to sometimes ask yourself to the degree to which you are going to demonstrate the weighing of both sides, as we say. Offering, comparing, or contrasting opinions in order to define the issue. Sometimes you might say, well, I don't want to give them the opposition too much time within the scope of my essay. But in a lot of cases, you want to present all of that because, again, that's going to really strengthen your ethos. That's going to show that you came to that conclusion only after copious study that considered all sides of an argument, okay? And we talk about this via, first off, antithesis. Showing both sides as equal offers the opportunity to objectively lean towards one in the end. So if you can demonstrate objectivity by saying, this is their argument, this is the other side's argument, your argument, and you nevertheless, after that very objective demonstration of both sides of the argument, you lean towards the one over the other, that's really helpful for you, okay? Because it doesn't sound like you came into that dispute or that debate already predisposed towards the one side of the argument. It's kind of like you gave equal weight to both sides. And that's what we want to see from someone who we're going to particularly trust, okay? The other situation that this arises with is antithesis, okay, which repeats a word in a way that uses it or defines it differently than prior in the text in order to evolve one's thinking or understanding, okay? So, for example, a classic example of this situation, I believe it's normally attributed to Ben Franklin after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. He said something to the effect, we need to hang together or we'll all hang separately, okay? So that word hang and sort of using that as two different parts of speech or having two different types of meaning in that particular context. That's what antithesis is all about in that case, all right? Now, we bring up in this case, just so that you're, on the same page with all this business, this concept of dialectic, okay? Which a lot of times people will talk about this. It's first off as a noun, as it says there, the purely logical debate of philosophers, the purpose of which is discover the truth through dialogue. That's why it's called the dialectic, because it's this whole concept that two people talk back and forth and build off of each other's ideas until they're invariably left with a truth that they both perfectly agree with. And that's a great situation to find yourself in a lot of cases. It's also not necessarily true. If this were that easily practiced and whatnot, the American government would run far more smoothly than it currently does. However, that doesn't mean we want to necessarily lose it as a goal, okay? If your goal going into any debate, into any rhetorical situation, is that you want to participate in the conversation and discover the truth through the acceptance and compromise of two different schools of thought, that's a great position to find yourself in. And it does build your ethos a great deal, okay? Now, in that dialogue that's supposed to exist in the dialectic, some things to keep in mind are that logical fallacies are forbidden, okay? And we'll talk a lot more about logical fallacies during a later unit, but any kind of logic that doesn't sort of pan out and make as much sense as it possibly could. Rhetoric, however, says, well, we don't really care about logical fallacies. We're just trying to change people's minds. It's kind of like how I told you guys before that rhetoric is about manipulation. And sometimes manipulation isn't fair and isn't cool and isn't fun, but it just wants to accomplish its end goal. Well, that's one of the reasons why rhetoric, they're cool with sometimes these logical fallacies, even if dialectic isn't, because this whole concept of the dialectic is that we're going to be using perfect logic without any flaws to it along the way, okay? That whole dialectic concept, as I mentioned, is represented by the back and forth conversation in which a teacher questions a pupil, allowing the pupil to discover truths about the existence in the process. And that's very much what the old school authors would have been talking about back in the day. When we're talking about like Aristotle and Plato, that's how they wrote a lot of their texts, from that perspective of a dialectic. The master and the pupil sort of working together through these problems to get to some sort of conclusion, okay? It's also often symbolized by two sides of an argument that, through conversation and compromise, find a middle ground in which they can agree. And like I said, that's the position you want to find yourself in, or at least seem like the position that you are in to your audience, okay? And really, that makes counterargument all the more important, okay? Because counterargument shows that you're accepting of the opposition's viewpoint. Counterargument shows that you've heard their side of the story and are conceding the points where they're accurate, but also are refuting or rebutting the points where they're not, okay? So really one of the strongest tools you're going to have in your toolbox as you try to go ahead and persuade other people and use your rhetorical skills in varied different formats and mediums is the whole concept of counter arguments. So you want to always have what your opponent has to say on the back of your mind, almost as much as you have what you're going to say on the back of your mind. Because if you know what your opponent's going to say, then you can make sure that it's so much less meaningful by interweaving your concessions, refutations, and rebuttals right into your own arguments. All right. So that's a little bit about counter arguments. As always, come to class with any questions or concerns that you may have on this matter. And I wish you all the best, friends.